Hello and Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas. Welcome to the Political Frenemies Christmas special, or as I'm going to unofficially call it, the Christmas Snowflake special.
You're just calling me Christmas Snowflake, aren't you, Chris? Come on, be honest.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think over the past few weeks, we've definitely established that, and. And this is a show. This is a show where a Conservative and a Liberal Democrat discuss politics. I am Chris Newton. I am a former Conservative defence policy advisor, and some might say, especially those of you Liberal listeners and viewers out there, some might say that I am the Ebenezer Scrooge of the political podcasting world.
Quite right.
and that person over there who's making that outrageous accusation against me is Mathew Hulbert, Liberal Democrat activist and former councillor. Merry Christmas, Mathew. Now, if I'm Ebenezer Scrooge, which Christmas character would you be?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm rotund enough to be Father Christmas himself. So, in that vein, Chris, and we'll get into why I don't have a Christmas jumper on in just a moment. But I thought I needed to give a nod to Christmas, given this is our Christmas special, our long-awaited and much-wanted Christmas special. Here we go, Chris. So, oh goodness, there we go. Yay! So there we go. So all I need is the beard. So I've just got a bit of fluff going on here. But yeah. So I thought I'd be Santa today, Chris. So what do you reckon?
No, that looks very nice. I forgot I was going to buy one, and then I didn't in the end. But I do. Yeah, that's true. But I do have the beard for it. Well, kind of. I don't really. It's not long enough. But it's as you can see, it's getting grey and white. So it's almost there.
I mean, I've got to hand it to you, Chris. You do. You obviously managed to grow a beard quite better than I do, because whenever mine gets, I mean, it's almost getting there now. Whenever it gets quite long, it just looks really dreadful, and I just have to, shave it off because it just looks so awful. But so I don't think I'll ever have a full bushy beard. It just doesn't do it. So there you go. But there you go. I'm quite liking this. I'm quite liking my style. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you should wear it all year round. Like the bloke who celebrates Christmas every day.
But the thing is, I mean, I know that song isn't there, isn't Christmas every day or whatever it is, but that wouldn't make it special. I mean, the whole thing about Christmas is that for those of us that really like it, and I know we both do, Chris, that, it's a special thing once a year. And, I think back to, I think of my dear late mum, and she absolutely adored Christmas. So, I'll definitely be thinking about her this Christmas time. But I must just explain that I know I said last week that I was going to try and get a Christmas jumper, and nothing would have pleased me more. And believe me, viewers and listeners, I did try. But as I say, I'm rather a rotund gentleman. There's only so many places that have my size, and none of those places. All I can say, Chris, as I just said to you off air there before we started recording, is that I think there's quite a lot of rotund gentlemen who've been buying Christmas jumpers because I couldn't get one from anywhere. So I'm really sorry for those of you that are watching. I'm afraid I've not got the Christmas jumper, but the Father Christmas hat is my little nod to the fact that this is indeed our Christmas special.
Well, I shall now come up with my excuse. Well, it's not an excuse; it's actually what happened. I did look in the shops this morning for a Christmas.
Was there not one cheap enough for you, Chris? Not one cheap enough. Not one cheap enough.
No, there wasn't. No, because I would only go to the cheap store because, as I said last week, I don't believe in buying an expensive jumper that you're only going to wear once or twice a year. So I went to the cheap store, let's say, and the only jumper I could find was a Nightmare Before Christmas jumper with a skull and a Christmas.
Which would have been so appropriate for you, not only as our Ebenezer Scrooge, but also as our resident Tory, taking off the poor and giving to the rich. That just would have been so appropriate for you.
Well, it's Labour now that's freezing the pensions. So
we'll get on to Labour momentarily, but yes, we just thought we'd give a bit of a nod, didn't we, to Christmas?
Yeah, and so basically, this is the closest thing I've got to a Christmas outfit.
Oh, that's kind of nice. That's not quite red. What is it like? What colour is that?
It's kind of like it is a burgundy sort of colour, isn't it? It's
yes, it is
dark red.
Lovely. The kind of wine we like. Do you like a burgundy, Chris?
I'm not actually a big drinker, but I do like the colour burgundy, even though I'm supposed to like Tory blue. I actually do. I do like. I don't like other shades of red, but I do like burgundy. I actually like royal colours. So maybe there's something in that.
Well, and just whilst we're going on about colours, and again, I'm afraid this is a comment for those of you that are watching. God love those of you that are listening, but we've just had to mention a few things that for those that are watching, is that in the special intros that you've done for us there, Chris, and indeed on this green line in the middle there, it's green this time for Christmas.
Yeah. So it's very much season appropriate, and I always like changing things up with the graphics and everything. But yeah, I thought let's get into the Christmas spirit, and let's reflect everything in our graphics that it's the Christmas season.
Now, can I just ask you, Chris, before we get into it, can I just say to you, what will you be doing with Christmas? Will you be with family?
I'll be with family. I will also be visiting my brother's family, and I'll be visiting my nephew and niece, who are children. And it's always nice to see your child relatives at Christmas, because it's really about them, and it's really nice to see them opening presents.
They could open presents as well. I mean, I don't know what. Yeah, but the great thing is. The great thing, Chris, with you and me is that the great thing with us, Chris, is that we're both uncles and both love being uncles. And yeah, I'll be going. Obviously, both my parents are sadly departed now, and I now spend my Christmas days very happily with my youngest nephews and nieces, and with their other nana who they live with. So very much looking forward to all the festivities with that. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. Christmas is really about children, and so it'll be great to spend time with them. So Chris, what are we talking about in our Christmas special?
Yeah, so if you're a regular to the podcast, you know what we usually do is to talk about the week's big developments. We're going to do something, because it's Christmas and because it's the end of the year, we're going to do something a little bit different. And we thought that as it's the end of the year, this is a good time to reflect and to especially talk about the politics of everything. We talked a lot about policy during the course of the last few weeks, but I think this is a time to take a step back and to examine the real kind of politics of everything. So what we're going to do is that we are going to take the four big British-wide national political parties, and so we're looking at Labour, we're looking at the Conservatives, we're looking at Reform UK, and we're looking at the Liberal Democrats, and we are taking each in turn, and we're looking at their situation at the moment, obviously the last year and especially the last 6 months that they've had, and also where they go from here. Now I just
pick you up on something though, Chris, before we even start, which is why are the Lib Dems not third in these rankings? We should be being discussed third. We have 72 MPs. We're the largest third force in the Commons in a century.
That is true, but isn't it more logical to really talk about the Conservatives and then Reform UK, because that's how I've kind of sorted it in my own kind of weird brain.
Okay.
But you have a point, but at the same time, Reform both during the election and now, they're above the Liberal Democrats in terms of the share of votes. And as a fan of proportional representation, surely it's the percentage of votes that matters.
Chris is just trying to upset me on this Christmas special, but I'm not going to allow it to work. I'm happy with our wonderful 72 MPs that are holding this government to account on a daily basis, and they're doing a fantastic job. And so that's my thoughts on that, Mr. Newton.
Yeah. But certainly the case, and that's something that we will get into. What exactly are the 72 MPs doing? So hopefully you'll be able to shed some light on that. But I can also hear some of you over through my computer saying, well, what about the Greens? What about the Independent Alliance? What about the SNP? What about Plaid? Which is a good these are good questions. Essentially, basically, if we did all of the big parties, then we'll be here forever. This will be a podcast that will last for the whole of the Christmas period. It will last for Christmas Day, Boxing Day, everything, and we simply can't do that.
We can't. And also, Chris, although we've both been quite lively for this podcast, we are a bit tired, the both of us, aren't we? It's been a busy old year. We've been very busy. We've launched this podcast, but we've also had our day jobs, and we occasionally appear on TV and radio and all the rest of it. And we're both quite tired, and so we're wanting this to be a nice but perhaps not all too long Christmas special that we wanted to do for you all, but we just couldn't. On another occasion, we will absolutely get into the Greens and the nationalist parties and others, because I think it's really important to do so. And we're not just an English podcast; we're a British politics podcast and a UK politics. We'll get into the Northern Irish situation as well. But just on this one today, to keep it short, we've stuck to the top four.
That's true, and we will. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities to discuss those other parties as well. But the criteria that I came up with is, firstly, in terms of the number of votes or the popular support that they have, especially at the moment, and those four parties are the top parties, and also in terms of their national media presence as well. It's really those four parties that at the moment at least are making the main headlines. And you could say, well, the Greens. The Greens have had an MP representation since 2010, I believe, and that's a fair point. But the Greens don't really make any media headlines, so there isn't really that much I've certainly got to say about them. But I'm sure one of the questions I do want to ask is whether the Greens pose a threat to the Liberal Democrats. So maybe we will.
Well, all I can say to our Green friends listening or watching is that those were the comments and views of Dr. Chris Newton, not necessarily the comments and views of me. But believe me, Greens and nationalist friends and others, we will get into talking about your political party soon. But in terms of brevity, we're just going to do the top four. I guess we have to be honest; they're the top four in England, aren't they? So the top four in England are the ones that we're doing. The ones that we're doing today. So there we are.
Okay, right. That's the agenda. Let's do this. So our first party, obviously we're going to come to the main party of government, Labour. And it's really been a year of two halves. They had obviously a massive success at the general election, winning that enormous landslide majority. So in that sense, the first half of the year has been extremely successful, and then it kind of went all downhill from there. They've had a really kind of torrid time in government over the past 5-6 months. So I think the main question to start off, firstly, is to ask, what do you make of Labour in government? And I've certainly am of the belief that it's been a very disastrous start. If you agree with me, Mathew, as well, why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, Chris, I am just going to remove this for the
Yeah.
moment. It may make a return towards the end of the podcast, so we'll see about that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you're right, Chris. This has been definitely a year of two halves for the government. I mean, obviously, we almost can't remember pre-Labour government now. So much has gone on, but obviously the Tories, your party, Chris, were exceptionally, rightly or wrongly, I would say rightly, but you'd perhaps disagree, but they were exceptionally unpopular. And so, really, I think in a sense, it was one of those, and this is almost always the case with when governments lose general elections. The government has lost the general election more than the opposition necessarily winning it because of their great vision or their great policies. And I think that was certainly the case this time round, because actually Labour were able to, we talked about this, I think, last week, Labour were able to win the election without really telling us very much at all about what they were going to do. And in a sense, they were very successful in doing that. They basically said, we're just not the other lot, and so they won the election on that basis. And, I thought the first few days, and literally just the first few days after they won, went very well. And I personally thought that, of course, I was going to disagree with them on some things. I'm not a Labour person, I'm a Liberal Democrat, two different parties. And, I felt that, yes, we'd disagree on some things, but that, some good people were in charge now, and that the adults were back in the room, and that we were going to have stable government, and there was going to be competent government. And then it all started to fall to pieces. And obviously, you can look at this from two perspectives. There's the policy front of what went on, and we can perhaps talk about that in just a moment. But there was the politics and what went on in, and this is real Westminster bubble kind of stuff, I have to admit. But we heard all about what has gone on in government in Downing Street. And actually, we can talk about that a little bit on the basis from the news. I know we're not doing the news this past week, but I'm just going to mention the fact that Sue Gray was announced this week, who was Keir Starmer's chief of staff, has been announced this week as going into the House of Lords. I think there's a little bit of compensation for the fact that she was kind of dumped and then given a kind of non-job of envoy to the nations and regions that never ended up happening. So hopefully she'll be happy in the House of Lords, and we'll be able to.
I'm sure she will.
Her views.
She will.
I'm sure she will too. So we've had all that going on behind the scenes in Downing Street. Now, I do think that probably you'd like to think at least that the team in Downing Street is now settled. Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney, and then all the rest. But it hasn't changed the people's perspectives of the government. It still seems to be really, really unpopular.
Yeah, it's interesting how unpopular the government has got very quickly, and it's the ratings have dropped quicker than any party that has just entered power that I can think of. And often you'll find in today's politics, it's making a good first impression is absolutely crucial. And if you make a first bad impression, it's almost impossible to recover from that. And it is, one thing, obviously one thinks about Truss. If you cast your mind back to IDS as well, he started off, there was a certain kind of expectation or lack of expectation at the start, from which IDS never recovered from. Interestingly, Keir Starmer had a bad first run or first part as leader of the opposition, and he was able to recover, although that's more to do with the opposition than perhaps anything that he did, although there was some interesting tactics going on. But I will take some issue with what you said about thinking that this Labour team a bunch of grown-ups and that politics was going to be restored as normal again. I have to say, I've never. You probably expect me to say this, but I've never really rated the Starmer's leadership or the top team. And if you cast back to his opposition days, what did he do? Well, he backtracked on pretty much every promise that he made. He flip-flopped during the COVID years. He was very much an opportunist in terms of 1 minute back in a gradual easing of lockdown and then opposing it as soon as the first whiff of it going wrong. And essentially, I don't think the way in which they try to explain things or their justifications are very good or very convincing. And they've obviously adopted this strategy of saying, right, let's do stuff that we would like to do but are unpopular. So, for example, the farm tax, the winter fuel payments, and let's pin it all on the Tories. Let's blame everything on the Tories in this 22 billion black hole. And as if we keep saying that, then people will believe our narrative and we'll get off with that. And the problem is that everyone can see through it, or a lot of people can see through it. So I've never thought that these were grown-ups, and I just think the way in which they go about things, the blatant way in which they contradict themselves, the hypocrisy. One thinks about the whole business of cronyism. You mentioned Lord's appointments earlier. I have to say, I never rated this government. So and also Starmer's a big part of the problem here. It's Starmer's, his lack of charisma, his inability to, especially during the riots, for example, he was a divisive figure rather than a unifying figure. His inability to articulate a mission or a vision or an objective. This is a serious problem, don't you think?
So I agree with you. Won't be surprised to hear, Chris, that I agree with some of what you say, and I disagree with other parts of what you say. Well, I mean, I think there is an issue with Starmer, and I'm not an original thinker in saying this. In fact, I think Diane Abbott has said it as well, amongst others. So it's a point regularly made, but it bears repeating. That I think here Starmer doesn't really get the politics. I think he's had quite an easy entry into Parliament. He's then risen up the ranks very quickly. He became leader without too much of a challenge. He became Prime Minister, let's face it, without too much of a challenge. And now in government, he doesn't appear to get the politics. And I'm assuming that he gets good advice. I mean, what we're meant to believe about McSweeney and others is that these are people that do get the politics. So whether he's just not able to take the advice and then think on his feet when he's in a public arena, be it the House of Commons or at a press conference or whatever. So I don't think he gets the politics as well as he really should as a leader of a political party and as Prime Minister. But then also I think it's these two things together that really are a problem. He isn't able to, as you I think quite rightly said there, Chris, provide a narrative for the public. I think some of the things that they've done might still have been unpopular, but if there'd been an explanation for some of them, the public might well have thought, well, I still kind of disagree, but okay, you said this, that, and the other, and I kind of follow that from your perspective, what you're doing, you think is right. Instead, they're just presented as policies that are extremely unpopular, and then the government seems shocked that they're unpopular. And so, I mean, again, whatever you think about the issue of the WASPy wound, right? And I know we're not doing this past week's news, but I'm just using this as an example, Chris. That whatever you think about that, and whether you think that there should be this compensation, it seems that the government, I mean, obviously they're trying to get the unpopular stuff out of the way quickly, and my goodness, there's certainly been a lot of unpopular stuff that they've announced, but they don't seem to be able to, from what I see and hear, and me and you both consume a lot of, the political programs and all the rest of it that go out. They don't seem able to provide a narrative explaining why they're doing what they're doing. And I think this really contrasts with the Blair days because, again, whatever you think about Tony Blair, I think he was, a supreme communicator for certainly the beginning part of his premiership. And when New Labour had tricky things that they were doing and that they wanted to do, they were able, I think, fairly successfully, and I think even William Hague, their opposition at the time, would much to their chagrin, obviously, would admit that Blair was able to go out onto the broadcast media and certainly onto longer form interviews and say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And you, as a member of the public, would then think, well, I might still disagree with that, but actually, I can understand the theory behind it. I can understand the narrative. You've explained it. Thanks very much. I still might not like it, but I can kind of understand why it's happening. Whether it's just because this Labour team, some of them at least, just aren't as polished, aren't as good kind of, secretaries of state and all the rest of it as in previous governments, I don't know. But it's quite a problem when the lead guy, the head person, the prime minister, number one isn't that charismatic. I think if that was the only problem, he could get past that. But number one isn't very charismatic. Number two doesn't get the politics, and number three can't set a narrative. I mean, that's a problem.
The lines are transparently bad. The explanation. So for example, with the various unpopular policies, whether it's regarding pensioners or the WASPy women or whatever, the line is always, well, we've got this black hole. We can't afford it, essentially, and it's all the Tories' fault. At the same time, they're spending money on big pay rises to public sector workers. They're spending money on GB Energy, which we don't know what exactly it does. Essentially, it's spending money on climate change aid and things like that. And you may or may not agree with some of those.
Yeah,
but,
the
explanation that there's they don't have the money. Well, they're clearly spending money for some things. Put it that way.
Well, indeed, they are spending money for some things. And as I've said on this podcast before, and again, I've no problem repeating it, I think the public will understand for a little while the government blaming the previous government, because, of course, that's what you'd expect them to do. But I think there comes a point, and I think we have already reached it with this government, because of how unpopular they are. I think we've reached it before we ordinarily would in a new government's term. I think we've reached the point where people are a little bit sick to death of hearing about the last government being blamed and want to hear about delivery from this new government. Now, I've said this before as well, that I think the only way out of this, I think, the first impression has been made about this government now, and it's broadly speaking an unpopular one for large sections of the electorate. I think that's baked in now. I think the only way, my view is, the only way for Labour to begin to overcome that and to begin, Chris, to turn this around so that they start doing better in the polls is to deliver. In my view, it has to be about the delivery now. And what we need to see is the NHS start, being turned around. We need to see, and you'll understand why I mentioned this one, but we need to start seeing ambulances getting to people within the set targets. We need to see, GP surgeries being open to see more patients. We need the NHS to be turned around, social care to be turned around. We need to see schools doing better. We need to see more police on the streets and more crimes being solved and more criminals being brought to book. And none of these things are easy. I'm not suggesting they're easy by any stretch of the imagination. It's very, very difficult indeed. But I think Labour have lost the political narrative. So the only way they can start to win this thing around is by delivery. And so that means that I think they're going to remain unpopular for quite some time until, from their perspective, hopefully, we start seeing actual changes in the real lived lives of people. And I think it's only then that the polls might start to change.
Yeah, they made an announcement, for example, this week on, and again, we're not covering this week's news, but it's relevant for this conversation. They have recently made an announcement on potholes, and this is, a part of a strategy of making a real difference on the ground to the day-to-day people's lives. And and you can see the logic behind that, and actually Morgan McSweeney is an interesting figure within the Labour movement, and is interesting from my perspective, because I only just realised that is that he was apparently a big part of the Labour strategy in Barking and Dagenham, which ultimately defeated the BNP, where the BNP managed to get some councillors, and in the subsequent that was in 2006, and then in 2010 Labour won the whole. Well, they won the whole council essentially
with Margaret Hodge.
With Margaret Hodge and John Cruddas. I do have a lot of respect for John Cruddas. McSweeney did a better job than I did, because I stood against the BNP, and they kicked my ass politically.
Oh, really?
I did. Unlike I don't think I ever told you this, but I did try to be a councillor, but unfortunately the BNP beat me to that. So. But it's interesting. So they've got
good on you for standing.
Understands. Sorry.
Good on you for standing again. Good on you for standing against them.
Yeah, and but it was very interesting at that time, because the people on the ground, they absolutely hated Labour at that point. But they preferred a lot of them preferred the BNP to the Tories. In fact, they looked at me with indifference. I didn't get much hostility, but they just didn't know what to make of the Tories. But so you think that clearly Morgan McSweeney is quite a political operator, but my gosh, he's got a real task on his hands here, hasn't he? Behind the scenes, trying to turn around the fortunes of this administration. Yeah, he's going to have a job making chicken salad out of chicken, basically. And he's got a poor leader and a poor team. So whether or not he's able to do that, I don't know. He's an interesting figure.
Yeah, and so what do you think? I mean, I've heard people, over recent times talk about that. Oh, how long are the Labour right or indeed the soft left going to be prepared to put up with Keir Starmer? I don't think there's any. I don't think after if Labour really want to make sure that they lose the next election, they'll start having leadership elections and start changing things around and start acting like the Australian Labour Party during the Rudd years. I don't personally think anyone sensible wants that. I think they've got Starmer till the next election now for good or ill. But that doesn't mean that there won't be chatter about what comes next after him should they lose the next election. And the fact that chatter is going on just really still a few weeks really into this government, we're only a few months in.
When they have the majority that they have as well, is extraordinary.
Absolutely. It is, but that's another point that I'm glad you've raised, actually, Chris, is that, yes, they've got a big majority, but it's very shallow, their support.
It's true.
I mean, what was it? 30-some odd percentage of the vote that they won this massive majority on. Number one, I think that says that we need a proportional representation system, and I would say that, wouldn't I, as a Lib Dem? But I also think it means that there was very little. Whereas I think for New Labour when they came in '97, and I was 17 at the time, and I remember getting, rightly or wrongly, getting swept up with the whole Blair thing and New Labour, and a new day has dawned, has it not, and all of that, on 1st of May, 2nd of May 1997, and whether you ultimately thought they were a good lot or not. I think even, some on the political right at that time, especially after 18 years of the Conservatives, thought that this is a new day and things will hopefully get better. There was none of that for this government. There was no great tide. It was just the fact that people were heartily sick to death of the Conservatives and were prepared to vote for whomever were the best people to displace them. And in some places that were Labour, in some places that were Liberal Democrats, and in some places that were Reform, in fact. So, and I'm sure amongst that there was some support for those political parties, but it wasn't a great tide. The fact is that people just wanted rid of the Conservative government. So, I mean, I think, you know, they haven't, I guess my point is, Chris, is that they haven't got a lot of political capital to lean on when things have started to go bad. And yet there doesn't seem to be at the top. And maybe there is behind the scenes. Maybe we're just not seeing it when Keir Starmer and others are in front of the cameras. But there doesn't seem to be any great recognition that they are, in fact, in trouble.
Yeah, they seem to think that, well, we've got this majority and we can do what we want. And it doesn't matter how bad our explanations are. We've got this, Labour, we've got this majority and we're plain sailing at the moment. And there does seem to be a level of denial and a level of a lack of self-awareness there. And it's extraordinary.
So from your perspective, Chris, and I'm interested to ask you this because you are obviously, you know, you're a Conservative, you're a former Conservative advisor. I mean, I guess from your perspective, you quite like to see them, you know, continue to remain unpopular and continue to do unpopular things. But I mean, what would your advice be to them to start turning things around? Do you agree with me that it has to be all about delivery now? They can't keep having relaunches of this government, can they? Because that will just look ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, because everybody's, you know, the public's real concern at the moment is with the machinery of government, the fact that nothing seems to be working. So yes, so having a, you know, to really focus on delivery and solving the big problems, immigration, the health service, and so forth. I don't think they have the answers to any of that. And what they're proposing is, I don't think is going to solve that. But that is one thing. I think also Labour have, if they start to also reopen Brexit, and no, they're not going to send us directly
that dreaded word
into the EU. If they start to unravel,
I'd be very happy for them to do that.
But I think if they want to drive the red wall to reform UK, fine, they should go ahead and do that. But if they want to keep the red wall, then they have to be very careful about how they renegotiate the Brexit deal as well. Because even though the polling says one thing, I still think that the perception of them kind of undoing a democratic vote, I don't think that will still sit well with red wall voters.
And there's another interesting perception as well. And part of me thinks this is unfair, but part of me also thinks that it is becoming a little bit of a thing, which is that Keir Starmer wants to be, you know, the theory goes, Keir Starmer wants to be anywhere but in Britain. And, you know, I mean, you know, when I first heard that, I thought, well, come on, give the guy a break. He's the Prime Minister. You know, he is going to be having to go to lots of things abroad. There's lots of conferences, you know, and lots of things that he needs to be seen at, and, you know, give the guy a break. But you know, having looked at the list of where he's gone so far, you've got to think that perhaps one or two of those visits weren't, strictly speaking, completely necessary. And so, you know, if he thinks he can avoid the problems back home by being abroad, well, I don't quite think that's very realistic either.
Yeah, and he had the nerve to criticise Farage over spending too much.
Well, Farage isn't the Prime Minister, Chris.
That is true, but if you want that line of attack to be effective, then you've got to be seen to at least have, you know, some degree of fair time in the UK as well. Now, as a foreign affairs and defence person, I do have some degree of sympathy with Starmer there, but again, is it excessive? Are some of these trips necessary? And then again, it plays into a narrative that, you know, Starmer is more comfortable internationally than say with being in Britain. Remember, he was asked a question: does he prefer Davos or Westminster? And he chose Davos. and he got away with that. But if he starts being perceived as being more abroad than actually taking care of bread and butter issues in the UK, that's already starting to be an issue for him, and that issue is going to be even worse for him if he's not careful.
Indeed, and if he becomes known as Davos man, I mean, I don't think that'd necessarily be kind of great for him in
You should be
way.
a Tory advisor. That's good. That's a good one.
Now, I mean, we're going to get onto the Tories themselves in a moment, but I mean, I guess if Labour have any hope, it is that the Tories and this new Tory leader, are just really not up to it. Now, we'll get into what we think about the Tories in just a second, but sticking with Labour, but thinking about the Tories, is that perhaps their only hope, their only saving grace, is that the Tories just won't be very good.
Yeah, that is that is a possibility, but I don't think you should bank your strategy on that. I think you've got to do something positive yourself. And as I just mentioned a while ago, there is a real threat, especially in the Red Wall, from Reform UK. And again, this other narrative that suggests that, well, both the Tories and Labour are useless. Let's try something else. Let's try Reform UK. So I think that would be a very complacent attitude and strategy if that's all they're banking on. It might have worked for them this time in 2024 in the election. I don't know if it will work for them again, but we'll have to see about that. And speaking of the Tories, I think this is the time to move on to the Conservatives. I know you've been very enthusiastic to talk about this, Mathew, to talk about the Conservatives. So obviously disaster in terms of the general election. So I think they had about, 121 seats. I mean, that is very low for a second party in opposition. I think they got around 160 odd seats when they were last in opposition, when they were at their absolute lowest. So this really isn't very good. Obviously Kemi Badenoch has become leader. She's only been in there like just over a month, and yes, I perfectly accept the arguments that the Tories and government were absolutely disappointing. Disappointing is a mild way of putting it. Those last years especially were not good at all. The party kept fighting among itself. It kept changing its leader, and it just lost sight of what it's meant to do, which is to govern effectively. So I perfectly accept all of those arguments, and I'm the first person to criticize the Conservatives for their absolute disappointing and woeful record in government. But they've got a new start with Badenoch. What do you make of her? And do you think that she is the candidate, she is the leader to take the Conservatives forward into an election victory?
So a few things about that. First of all, I mean, I think you and lots of others, Chris, have said that, wow, she's this wow speaker, and you just wait, and she's going to be fantastic. Well, all I can say is that I've not seen it yet, Chris, and I've genuinely tried to be fair when watching her at Prime Minister's Questions, which at the moment is pretty much the only time that we really get to see her on a major platform. And, I think she's no doubt tried her best. And of course, she would have taken lots of advice about what to go on and what not to go on, and, how to perform and whether to try and be funny or all the rest of it. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but for me at least, I just don't get where the pizzazz is. I just don't see it. I think she falls flat on nearly every occasion, and really should be. I mean, given all that we've just said, Chris, about this government and how bad it's been and the torrid time that it has had and all the rest of it, really these should be open goals for whoever is the Tory leader. And I just don't. I think they're being missed, at each and every turn. Now, she's only a few Prime Minister's Questions in. Maybe she will get better, and I'm sure she's seeking advice, but I think she really needs to take advice and perhaps from some different people, because I just don't think it's working for her at the moment. So that's one thing. Number two, I think, and I've long thought this about Kemi Badenoch, and I thought it might, perhaps change when she became Tory leader, but it certainly hasn't thus far. That, she really is a culture wars person, and that's, I think, is where she is at her most happiest. When, from her perspective, I'd obviously disagree with her on almost every single sentence that she says on these types of issues. But I think she's happiest when, attacking certain minorities, and when saying woke this and woke that and all the flipping rest of it. I thought that was all right for when she, well, I mean, I didn't think it was all right. I'd prefer no one ever talked about those things, especially when it's a kind of attacking minorities. But from her perspective, yeah.
Has she done really much of that as leader of the opposition?
Well, she's certainly gone off to, America and seen a load of, I would think, slightly odd kind of alt-righty type people over in America. I read reports of, and so I just think that would you think, Chris, that she has been really focusing on what I would call the bread and butter issues that most people vote on? I don't think I've heard that much from her on those things.
I have to say I don't really know what alt-right figures. I generally don't know what it is you're referring to there. But
she met JD Vance amongst one, but I grant you that he's going to be the vice president. So okay, but right. but there were other. I can't remember them now offhand, because I read him report in passing a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, that she was in the United States. But let's put it this way, Chris. I think it is on those subjects that she is at her happiest, not necessarily when talking about hospitals and schools and police and defence and all the rest of it. And I think if the Tories are, let's put it this way. I think that if it wasn't for the fact that this government was so unpopular, one of the big political stories that would be being discussed is Kemi Badenoch up to being Tory leader. I think she's gone under the radar because the focus is on how terrible this government is. So in that sense, she's been quite lucky. But if the government starts to turn things around, the focus might well go back on her and whether she's up to leading the Conservatives for any great length of time.
Yeah, I would say, I think in terms of her focus, I think she's mostly been reacting. So she's been reacting to what the main story of the day. So, for example, the farmers' tax, and there is a or not. So she's sorry, your screen went a bit funny there, but I think she was reacting to a big story and exploiting at least one political opportunity. I do hear the criticism about kind of what she's doing. She's not making an impact. When you think about what she's been trying to do, she's actually been doing more than I think people give her credit for. So she made a big speech on immigration. She's been doing a lot of campaigning on the farms tax. She met Clarkson sort of very recently as well, and I would say the criticism there is that she's often a couple of weeks behind on these issues. She doesn't like go for them straight away. There's a bit of a lag. There's a little bit of a gap there. So she has. So I think the criticism, or she hasn't been doing anything. I think that's a bit unfair. She has been doing some things. The question is this making the impact? And there is a question mark there, and this question about how she is, especially at prime minister's questions, or is she perceived to be someone who is a credible, capable leader? And I want to drill down about that, because I do have my own ideas about this, but I'd like to ask you first of all, is kind of when. And maybe you can't articulate this. Maybe it's kind of one of these things that you can't put your finger on. But when you say you look at her prime minister's questions and you just don't see it, I mean, what is the issue there? What do you think is the problem there?
I think it's fairly flat-footed, but yeah, even that flat-footed, not easy to say. I think that she doesn't quite do, she's no William Hague in terms of the comedy lines. I think that she often manages to, when trying to use the football analogy, when trying to kick an own goal, she manages to somehow kind of fling her boot off and hit herself in the head. So, things that Starmer's able to say, well, look what you said on this, that, or the other. And then when she has quotes put back to her, she seems to not quite be able to react to them. She doesn't seem, to my mind at least, to be able to react very well on her feet, which I think you need to do at PMQs, which actually Starmer is not bad at. Starmer is not bad at. I think actually.
I would say
credit.
he's terrible at, but he has got better. Ironically, since Badenoch became leader, he has got a little bit better. But I don't rate Starmer at Prime Minister's question either, to be honest.
Right. And so, I mean, so from your perspective, then, Chris, and obviously with this being a special where we're not reacting to the news, we can perhaps have a little bit of time to talk about this. So you were when the Tories were last in opposition, you were a defence policy advisor to the Tories, and without necessarily thinking about defence specifically, but just advice to the Tories more generally. I mean, what do you think the advice is? I mean, is it, of course, if there's a big political issue of any week, of course, the main opposition party, especially, is going to focus on that. But there has to be a strategy behind that, doesn't there? About, yes, we've got to oppose the government when it's right to do so and kick up a stink when there's a controversy going on. But also, there has to come a point, and maybe it's not yet because we're still early into this new government, but where we start saying what we would do. We have to become credible as an alternative government. So, I mean, number one, so what advice would you give? And number two, in terms of, obviously, advisors must kind of talk amongst each other. I mean, do you think there's confidence amongst her advisors that this next election can be won and that there's a strategy working towards that? Or I mean, I don't know if you hear anything from current Tory advisors, but even if you don't, what would be your theory about what is perhaps going on behind the scenes?
Good questions. But before I get onto that, I just want to react to something you said previously about what might be perceived as the problem with Kemi, and this is a theory. It might not be a convincing theory, but I think there might be something to this. I think, firstly, I think she has improved at Prime Minister's questions, especially over the past few weeks. I think her delivery has got better. The strategy of Prime Minister's questions is still questionable. And I've said this before about her hammering Starmer on something and then moving on to something else. And the scattergun approach is a tactic at Prime Minister's question. If you want to put your opponent or the Prime Minister, you want to sort of confuse him and force him to think on his feet and force him to think about different issues at once. I don't think that's the right strategy in this instance. I think, first of all, she needs to really sort of focus her issues and really kind of make things uncomfortable for Starmer. And you only do that by pressing. You focus on one issue, get Starmer to make a answer to repeatedly to that issue, and then go to the press and say, look, and make that the issue of the day. I think that is a better strategy at this stage of the parliament than just simply going on different issues and hoping that Starmer will slip up because he's having to think about different issues essentially at once. I think Starmer's a problem. So I think Kemi's problem with her perception is her age. I think she is she's young. She's in her 40s. One thing I do love about politics is that you can still be in your 40s and still be considered a baby, essentially. So there's hope.
There's a time for us yet, Chris. Our day may still yet come.
She isn't only because there have been leaders her age or around about her age. Sunak had the same problem. I think they just looked too young to, especially when you're up against someone in their 60s, established like Starmer.
I mean,
There is a problem there.
the interesting thing is that Blair, I think, was only 44, wasn't he, when he became?
Yeah, but even
Yeah,
he was called Bambi, right?
he was.
If you
That's true.
remember. And
Yeah,
even when people forget this with Cameron, when Cameron was up against, and this is what I do have like first-hand knowledge of, when Cameron was up against Brown, Brown was seen as the person with substance. He was the chancellor for 10 years. He was the Iron Chancellor and so forth. Cameron was seen as a bit flaky, as the comedian, as someone who didn't have that substance yet. He only really got that perception when he became prime minister. So
right.
I think that is an issue. That might be a potential issue, and she might need some more training to, do what Thatcher essentially did, and try and work on her image and
So,
so
what would
forth.
your advice be to her
My
as an
advice
advisor? Yeah,
would be is that I think the advice that she's been given is that, well, you've got 5 years. You can essentially
right.
take your time essentially and develop your program, and that would have been the right perhaps good advice in my time when I was working in the late 2000s. But we're in a very different landscape now. We've got reform as a real threat. So yes, ideally, in an ideal world, Basenock should take her time and to develop her policies and develop her thinking and so forth. But I don't think she has that luxury, and she does need to make more noise. One of the things that concerned me, one of the things that she said in her campaign, that her leadership campaign, that concerned me, was that she said, well, I'm not going to be one of these leaders that's going to be making speeches every 5 minutes. Now that is a good attitude to take if you're the prime minister, and maybe if you're the leader of the opposition when things are going well. But the problem is that it's a very crowded market now. You've got obviously Farage, but also Davey with 72 MPs, and you need to make noise. She needs to make impact. One of her, I think, her problems is that she's not being heard at the moment that much, and
Right.
she does need to make herself more visible. And this would be
And
my advice.
yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that she's not necessarily making headlines, and that Farage, again, whatever you think of him, and I'm clearly not a fan. The fact is that he does know how to make headlines. He's very, very good at that, and he does so on an almost daily basis. And he is the kind of right wing opposition to this government that is being heard regularly. And the concern from a conservative perspective would be that they're just not really talked about, and that they're just forgotten, and that at the next election they'll lose even more seats.
Yeah, and my concern is that the people that she's got around her, and maybe Nadine Dorries is right about the people that she's got around her, like essentially the people who's been influential in the party and essentially messed it up. I don't know firsthand about that, but it's a credible theory. Put it that way. If it is people like that advising her, they're probably telling her what I've said about take your time. You don't need to rush into things and so forth. But the Tories have been invisible, especially during the course of the leadership campaign. And I do think it is not ideal advice, but she probably doesn't have the time frame that a normal leader of the opposition would have, or a normal conservative leader in opposition has.
Absolutely. And perhaps finally on the Conservatives, Chris, before we move on to Reform UK. I mean, when I was watching Prime Minister's Questions the other day, and I was looking at the Tory front bench, I did think to myself, and you may disagree, but I did think to myself, gosh, this is one of the weakest Tory front benches that I can ever remember. Now, ultimately, she's only got 121 MPs to pick from. But that could prove to be a problem, couldn't it? That it's just a fairly weak front bench.
I think you have a point there. I think you can say exactly the same about the Labour cabinet as well.
Right.
I think,
but they are in government; they can do stuff, you know.
That's true, and I think with both of them, I think one of the problems is that I think, and this is perhaps a sign of insecurity, but I think both of them, they don't want to promote people who might who might overshadow them. So that's why. So you have a lot of good people on both sides, either in the Minister of State level or they're on the back benches. And you can understand why they might want to do that, but that reduces the firepower, that reduces the noise in which they're going to make. And so to give one example, I don't quite understand. I don't quite understand why someone like Mark Francois, with all of his experience as armed forces minister, I know you might vehemently disagree with me, but one thing about Mark Francois is that he knows how to get heard. He knows how to get on the media and to make a point.
Yeah.
And I would have appointed him shadow defense secretary, not shadow armed forces minister. So and there are people on the back benches who, and again, the Braverman, whatever you think about her. But even Esther McVeigh, but these people know how to campaign, and there are some, with the greatest of respect to the front bench, the people in there don't necessarily know how to make that kind of impact. And as I said, number one priority of the Tories at the moment is to just get heard, and just to remind people that you exist, and that the party's changing.
Because
the other thing is that people aren't willing to listen as well, because the other problem that Kemi has is that every time she says something, criticizes the government, people legitimately say, well, why you had 14 years? Why didn't the hell you didn't do that in government? That is a very difficult problem to overcome. That's really difficult.
It absolutely is. So there's that they can say, you've had 14 years, but they can also say, Kemi Badenoch has not been shy at coming forward at her views about almost everything during her time in government over the past few years. And so Starmer, will have had his people, and clearly has, write up a list of her quotes to fling back at her when she said something that might not be entirely in line with what she's previously said when or what she's done when in government. And of course, you'd expect him to do that, to have stuff to reply to her with Prime Minister's questions. And that's what I mean, that she seemed a bit flat-footed, because when that happens, to my mind, she doesn't seem able to and surely they must war game this out when they're preparing her for Prime Minister's questions, that, well, when you say this, he shall say this. What is going to be your reply to that? Either she doesn't seem very good at riposting back to him, from my perspective at least. And as I say, I really do try and watch these things independently. I'm prepared to say she has what I think is a good week, that she's had a good week. But to my mind, at least, that hasn't yet happened. So we'll see if she gets better at that. But I agree with you that, any opposition, as I was going to say a few minutes ago, the only thing that you can do as an opposition is two things. Number one, attack the government. Obviously an important job of any opposition party. But also, secondly, say what you would do. And you can only talk about what you would do because obviously you're not able to do it because you're the opposition. The one benefit that Labour has, as a disastrous a start as it has had, is that it can always attempt to win back the news agenda and to win people back round to them by doing stuff. The opposition isn't able to do that. It can only say about what it would do. And we're going to get on to talking about reform in just a second, but I think you're right. I think Kemi Badenoch is really the first Tory leader. Obviously, this is the first time that reform have been, in Parliament now and a parliamentary force. She's the first Tory leader that has a party outflanking the Tories on the right. I guess UKIP kind of did that for a brief moment, early, I think, in the 2010s. But really, But UKIP, in terms of, I know they had a couple of people go over to them and who then won by-elections, fair enough. But they weren't kind of second in a whole load of seats, were they, at any time? And so Kemi is the first Tory party leader to have a party outflanking her on the right, a populist party outflanking her on the right. And the danger from a Conservative perspective, as you quite rightly say, Chris, is that they'll just be forgotten. They just won't be heard, and they'll just be forgotten. And there's a real danger of that.
And people are, people in my Twitter sort of circles are already saying that all Reform are the real opposition now, and they've got to do something about that essentially. And that is a nice segue. Yeah. So go on.
No, well, it is a nice segue, but just briefly to say that there's a dual danger actually for the Conservatives, because there's the Tories there's Reform, on the right. I'm thinking in terms of opposition parties here, but there's the Lib Dems, on the left, and in terms of that one, there are still One Nation Tories and there are still One Nation Tory voters. Might not be quite as many as they once were, but there are still One Nation Tories and One Nation Tory voters. I don't think they'll necessarily be very pleased with Badenoch as leader at all, and it'll be interesting to see if more of those do leak away to my party, to the Lib Dems.
That's a good point. One of the things that perhaps I should have mentioned is the fact that, and I've always said this, and this has been evidence throughout the Tories' time in government, is that you've essentially got at least two parties within the one party, and the two factions really don't seem to agree on much these days. So the question is will the party let Kemi actually lead and forge her own direction, or will she become like all of the other leaders essentially, and essentially sort of struggle in the face of substantial opposition from within the party?
So let me ask you then, Chris. Let me just put you on the line here, and we'll look back on this perhaps in a year's time.
Okay.
Do you think Kemi Badenoch will still be Tory leader when we do the Christmas special next year?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
You just don't know with this, with the Tories, because they change the leader every five minutes. But I think she should be given a year to at the moment. I think people, as I said last week, there is a lot of bad faith, not just from the left, but the right as well. And I think it's ridiculous not to give her a fair run. It is and the Tories will look ridiculous if they change a leader again.
I agree.
This early into the parliament, they would just look even more ridiculous than they did over the course of the past 5-6 years. So yes. Moving swiftly on to Reform UK, and it has been quite a year for Reform UK. You've got that during the election campaign, that extraordinary situation where Richard Tice handed the leadership essentially to Nigel Farage, and they managed to achieve somewhat of a breakthrough. They managed to get 5 MPs, and Farage managed to finally become an MP. So that's that's a real achievement for them. And since then, they've been they achieved 14%, I think, during the election, and since then they've been climbing into the 20s. In terms of their polling. So Reform UK does have momentum. What do you make of how they've conducted themselves during the parliament so far, and do they have the ability to supplant the Tories as the main party of the right?
Well, look, I mean, much to my chagrin, because, I don't like their politics, and, that's a statement of the obvious. But this has clearly been a breakthrough year for Reform UK, winning those 5 MPs, getting that significant share of the vote. And, it's true to say that if we did have PR, and obviously I'm a big supporter of proportional representation, As I've said several times on this podcast, and again, much to my sadness, it would be the case that it would be Nigel Farage asking the 2 questions each week at Prime Minister's Questions, and not Ed Davey. The Lib Dems actually would still have about the same number of MPs that we won at the general election, but Reform would have won more had we have had PR. But as I've said in the past, you can't just back PR when your people are going to benefit from it. The fact is that you back PR because it would be a better representation, a fairer representation of how people actually voted. And of course, PR is just about the one issue that the Lib Dems and Reform UK agree on, because we both back proportional representation. But clearly, it's been a breakthrough year for Reform, and to say anything else would just not be telling it as it is. And you're quite right, Farage, after all of those attempts, has finally become a member of Parliament. I did think, and I'm now not sure whether I was quite right on this or not, but I did think that actually he'd find it quite stifling, and that he was used to being able to be where he wanted when he wanted, and being on the telly and doing all this stuff, and I still think that there's lots of parts of being an MP that he probably thinks are a bit of a pain in the neck. I think he himself would see himself as being best when out campaigning and out doing his shtick and out being the populist and all of that. I don't think I know that me and you have had this chat before, Chris, but I don't think he's all that bothered. I would allege that I don't think he's all that bothered about his constituency and about kind of representing people. I know that you would perhaps say that I'm being unfair to him about that, but I don't think he's particularly bothered about some aspects of being an MP. But equally, I guess it does give him and his party more gravitas than it had before. The fact is they are now a parliamentary force, and clearly a significant electoral force. And so I think all parties have to be aware of them. But I will just make this point. I think parties have to be aware of them, but not necessarily try and ape them. And I think the Tories are trying to ape them. And as we just mentioned in our previous discussion, I think the Tories have to remember that not only do they have Reform to their right, but they have the Lib Dems to their left, and indeed Labour, and they lost seats to all 3 at the general election. And so it's going to be quite interesting to see which way the Tories face. In terms of Reform UK, I mean, they'll clearly be looking forward to the next election. But I think another thing is true as well, Chris, is that they now are facing more scrutiny than ever before, and are not necessarily very good at... The interesting thing about Farage, actually, is that, I guess I'd put it this way, he's very good at giving it, right? He's not necessarily very good at taking it. He takes real umbrage when he's asked questions about perhaps some of the perhaps not so great things that some of his MPs have allegedly done in the past. He takes great umbrage at that how dare I be asked a question about my party? How dare I be put under scrutiny by the media? Well, sorry, mate, you're a political party leader of a parliamentary party now, and
it's
actually
interesting you say that, because I think that's more Starmer than Farage. I mean, Starmer's visibly, he visibly, you can tell he's never been sort of questioned, and when Starmer's asked a question, especially about him and kind of the integrity, cronyism, the Lord Ali situation, is he sees questions of that kind as an affront, and as him saying, well, I'm one of the good guys, why are you saying that I'm one of the bad guys? But that's Starmer. But maybe I think occasionally maybe Farage gets that like that, but I think Farage is probably the best at answering questions and actually thinking on his feet and dealing with media. And I think that's largely because he's been, well, despite the fact that he's only just been an MP, he was an MEP for years. And of course, he has his media career as well. So he knows how to play the game. He knows how to...
But don't you think, Chris, and sorry to cut across you there, but just on that point, don't you think that it's a little bit rich, actually, for Nigel Farage to claim not to be of the establishment? He is one of the most establishment MPs ever. Was in the city, was in the European Parliament for all of those years. now an MP. I mean, don't try and claim that you're anti-establishment when you are establishment.
It depends what you define as establishment, isn't it? It's okay if the traditional definition of it is along traditional socio-economic sort of class lines where you've been to school and so forth, and on that, and that's where I think people place Farage as the establishment. But there's more to it than that, I think. And whether you're a member of the establishment or whether you're anti-establishment, I think it has a lot to do with what you think, as well as what, or indeed instead of where you come from. So and certainly in terms of what Farage thinks, he's definitely on the outside of like the traditional mainstream. Hence why the political mainstream absolutely hate him. So in that sense, I think in fact you still can call, I think, Farage an anti-establishment figure. The other thing also is that there isn't in history, there isn't one elite. There are different elites, and sometimes you have an elite which is in the ascendancy, which has the political control, and then you have other elites trying to vie for power and influence. And it could very well be that Farage represents an anti-establishment elite that isn't a part of the sort of centrist social managerialist elite that has been running things for the past 30 years.
Well, I mean, that may or may not be the case, but don't you think that there's a danger as well, Chris, that I mean, if you say, Starmer isn't good at the politics, and I don't think he is, I think I'd say that Farage, from his perspective, is good at the politics, but I still think sometimes he gets it wrong. If he wants his party to be taken seriously, doing a video, and I know it may have been supposed to be a joke, but doing a video where he described various kinds of milk as woke, I mean, give me a break. I mean, come on.
You wait until we get on to Ed Davey. I'm telling you that. I'm telling you this now. You're not in a position to really.
We shall get onto my wonderful. We shall get onto my wonderful, glorious party leader in just a moment. But I mean, seriously, I think. I mean, come on, Farage. I mean, different types of milk are not woke. I mean, I just thought that was a nonsense, to be entirely honest with you. Now, the big question is, Chris, is that, is there going to be, or is there even going to be any need for a Tory reform pact at the next election? And can we? I mean, I personally think Farage is overreaching when he says he's going to be prime minister. But I mean, can you conceive at the next election? I mean, I think we've got to talk about the next election because there's no point in trying to really talk about ones beyond that. But can you conceive at the next election, at least, any possible circumstance where Nigel Farage ends up as prime minister?
I think there should be some kind of accommodation between the Conservatives and Reform, especially if both parties continue the polling that they do. Will there be, or is there a likelihood of that happening? I don't see it. I don't see it because the Conservatives are very proud of their identity and their history, and the fact that they're the oldest political party. And as I said earlier, there is a big wing of the Conservative Party that absolutely hates Farage, and you can see that whenever they appear on the media, they seem to hate Farage more than they hate Starmer, and their favourite line seems to be, "Well, we're not going to offer simplistic solutions like Farage does." So there is a real antipathy among a big group of Tory MPs towards Farage and his style of politics.
And they could break away.
Sorry,
they could break away. They could break away off to the Lib Dems, couldn't they? Some of them.
Yeah, and that may or may not happen, and it will only have that some kind of accommodation will only happen if that happens. If those Tory MPs move off either on their own or to the Lib Dems, and that leaves the rest of the right to then unite. But I do think the situation from a from a conservative point of view, and I mean this from a small c conservative point of view, of having two parties polling, in the ballpark figure, undercutting each other and preventing them from winning seats, that's not going to be acceptable. And that's going to lead to, regardless of how badly Labour does, that's going to lead to Labour winning again another election, even if they perform badly in government.
Do you ever see, Chris, at all, the Tories getting to such a point where even they have to start backing the possible idea of proportional representation?
I've always said, if we have continual elections where the results are totally out of whack, and then we have a successive a number of elections where the votes and the seats really don't match up, and there's real kind of injustice, even I would have to, or if we end up with a situation where we don't have the two-party system as it has been anymore, then you do have to look at that. And even as someone who's a big supporter of first past the post, I would say that first past the post is designed for a two-party system. It is not designed for a multi-party system. So from that perspective, maybe I don't see that in this parliament. And from my perspective, I think we should hold on to first past the post as long as possible, because, and this is the strange thing with reform, is that they break away from the Tories because they don't like how they do things, and they have political and policy disagreements. But under PR, the only way in which they're going to influence anything is by working with people that they don't like. So I never thought that made sense from a Reform UK perspective. And I would urge them to rethink their position on PR. But you can understand why that would be. But one question I would ask you, because I know you love this guy and we've talked about him before. Obviously, there's been recently this big hoo-ha about whether Elon Musk will make a donation. Obviously, you would have to do that presumably through a UK-based company. Do you think that this is a big story? Do you think that this is a game changer? And is the potential involvement, and Elon Musk is already commentating on British politics, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or is this leading us down a road to, to something that we don't particularly want in our politics?
Well, I mean, I think that reform may come to rue the day that Mr. Musk, got involved with them. I mean, it's interesting that, I don't know, we're not talking about this week's news, but it's interesting that on the day that we record this, there have been reports that, I mean, allegedly, I'll say, apparently, Elon Musk has apparently declared support for the AfD in Germany, which is the far right party in Germany, the alternative for Deutschland. I mean, this clearly worries me, and I think it should worry everyone who claims to be in support of mainstream, if I can use that word, democratic politics, across the world and across Europe. I mean, I would argue that this guy has his own agenda, that he has his own political agenda, and he has his own agenda for his businesses. And I just wonder whether a few years down the line, reform might rue the day that he got involved with them. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, I have not agreed with everything that Musk has said, but particularly on Ukraine. But and I do understand the arguments about having sort of rich people from overseas. It's not just on the right; it's on the left as well. And there's been plenty of people on the left that use their money to influence the political debates, and as long as they do it legally, they're entitled to. But I do. But in some respects, on the other hand, I do like the fact that we have someone like him speaking up for free speech and keeping an eye on sort of potential transgressions there, whether you think the examples he cites are good examples or not.
But Chris, don't you think that folks like Elon Musk, and I have to say Nigel Farage and others, proclaim to believe in free speech, but actually what they believe is free speech for everyone who thinks along their lines of thinking. You know, they're not so keen on free speech for those of us who disagree, are they?
Well, I mean, I can't think to hand of any examples where they've tried to shut down the speech or say that the speech of others shouldn't go ahead. There may be. I just can't think of any at the moment. But this is the danger of the left. If they continually, because our politics have been on the basis of agreed norms and rules, and one of those is that both sides are allowed to express themselves, obviously within certain legal parameters, but that has been an unwritten rule in our politics. As soon as one side breaches that leads to the other side to then say, well, we're not playing this game anymore. When we have the power, we're going to impose our will as well. So the left, I would say, is playing, and the right would be as well. But
Chris, don't you think that by constantly claiming things, everything from milk to whatever the heck else as woke, is whenever they say that word, what they basically mean is we're stopping discussion about this because we're declaring it as woke, and therefore it's all wrong. And that's the end of that discussion. It's woke. So there you go. That's the end of that. When actually it should be about having a decent discussion about things, and not just declaring everything as woke, and not stating what they mean by that. What I think of woke, and as you know, I'm one day I'm going to actually get a badge made for myself to wear it on here, saying I am proudly woke, because well, what I understand that word to be about is being awake to, alert to, aware of the fact that some minority groups are persecuted because of who they are. Now, I think that is a statement of fact, in actual fact. But now everything, including milk, types of milk, described as this word, and I don't think it's.
So is that really shut? Do you feel that you're being shut down when people use that?
Well, the other great irony is that a lot of people who claim to be being shut down by woke universities or all the rest of it, quite often are saying so on national media platforms. So, I mean, if that is being shut down and being cancelled, then here's to us all being cancelled, you know. I mean, I just think, give me a break with some of these people who claim to be being shut down and being cancelled, and yet they're saying so on their various different national and international media platforms. I mean, give me a break with these people.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want. I'm probably responsible for this, but I don't want to sort of turn this into, you know, a massive discussion about sort of free speech and woke and things like that. Firstly, for those people who you say are able to do that on their platforms, in many respects, they're the lucky ones. For every one of those people, there are people who don't have those platforms who are being affected in those. And I know many of them, right? I well, not many of them, but I know some of them through my line of work. They don't have the platforms, and their careers are stifled in various different ways.
Isn't it? But Chris, isn't it because, and I'm not saying this in all the cases, and I obviously don't know the specific examples that you're thinking of, but isn't it sometimes the case it's because these people have said or done things that are beyond the pale of what society is prepared to accept?
Well, many of the examples I can think of is some of them. Some of them may have said that, but a lot of them say things which are contested, but which a lot of people would still consider to be reasonable speech. I'm thinking, and I know you would disagree with this, but expressing opinions about what they consider to be biological sex is about. You might vehemently disagree with that, but they're entitled to to say that, and they're entitled to say they have the science to back that up.
But in which case, Chris, that I've always said that. Well, I can only speak for myself. I've always said, look, I'm not the thought police, but what I also think is that if you're going to say statements which are very controversial and which kind of attack a group of people, then be prepared to be challenged on what you say. What I think some of these people think of as free speech, and this is the point that I was trying to make earlier on, is that they think that they should be allowed to say exactly what they want, and then the argument ends. And that they shouldn't be, and when they are challenged, they don't claim to be being cancelled. Well, no, if you're going to make these statements, be prepared to back them up and be prepared to face challenge on what you've said.
There is a difference between being challenged. I think most people would tolerate and welcome, and people's jobs, livelihoods being affected. There is. I've always believed that, of course, if you say something, you're liable to be challenged. Where I think the line is crossed is that if you say something which most people, which a reasonable person would say, well, I might disagree with that, but it's in the realm of a reasonable position or saying, and then their careers are threatened. And their livelihoods are threatened, or indeed they get the police involved and so forth. And I would say my definition of woke differs from yours. I would say that woke is a.
Well, I think mine is the factual one, actually. But there you go.
I'd say mine is the factual one, because woke is, as far as I see it, is the colloquialism for the critical theories that emanate in scholarship and the universities. It's based on an actual scholarly phenomenon, and it's not just something that someone's made up. There is a big body of literature which I vehemently disagree with, by the way, and that's what. But even if people don't realize that when they say that, that's what it is. Right, that's what all of these ideas are based on. It's based on those ideas: critical theory, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, the gender theory is all of those, and that's based on stuff that essentially comes out of the universities, which we are increasingly forced to adhere to, even though many of us disagree with. But anyway,
well, we'll draw a line under that,
away
and shall we move on to a political party, everything of which they say is entirely reasonable and and entirely wonderful, and that is, of course, my great party, the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, right. But actually, to be slightly serious, you've had the Liberal Democrats have had a really good year.
Very good year.
You've won. The Liberal Democrats have won 72 seats, which I don't like to hear that often, but that is a reality. That is a fact, and that is that surpasses like even the Clegg and the Kennedy eras, right? It's amazing, isn't it? Really. But so you have all of these MPs, and you have this platform now. What are you going to do with it?
Well, I mean, I do think that we should just, I know that, I mean, I myself sometimes cringe during the general election campaign when I saw Ed Davey doing all of his stunts, but I do think they cut through to people, and the people thought this is a guy that doesn't take himself, that takes the politics, as he said at the time, that takes the politics and the issues seriously, but doesn't actually take himself too seriously. And I think that, along with the PPB that he did on caring, and on the fact that he genuinely understands what it is to be a carer, I do think that really cut through with people. And then that, combined with how unpopular the Tories were, meant that the Lib Dems were able to achieve not only our best ever result since the modern merged party was formed with the Social Democrats in the late 80s, but indeed the best result for any third party force in the Commons since for about a century. So this was a real significant breakthrough for liberalism in the UK. Now, and actually, it's interesting that just this past week, actually, I don't know if you saw this clip, Chris, but one of our new intake was hammering Amazon on the select committee. They had people representing Amazon there, and he was really questioning them. And of course, for many years, we weren't big enough to have people on select committees and to be able to be part of that parliamentary work, which might not be much seen, but which is actually really important in holding not just the government to account, but in holding powerful institutions to account. And I really thought it was actually Joshua Reynolds, one of the new Lib Dem intake. I think he's going to be a name to watch in the future in the Liberal Democrats. And it was really good to see him sat there in that committee, really taking Amazon to account in terms of how it allegedly treats its workforce and other issues too. And then I saw Layla Moran and Alistair Carmichael at the liaison committee holding the Prime Minister to account, as they are now chairs of select committees. And again, it's the first time since really since pre the coalition that Lib Dems have been able to, that we've been a big enough force to have chairs of select committees. And actually, in terms of agriculture with Alistair Carmichael, and especially in terms of health with Layla Moran, those are significant, chair positions to have. And I really think that they're going to come into their own in chairing those committees. So I think in terms of how Parliament works and how it holds the government and others to account, we are going to see that there are now Lib Dems in those very senior positions, and obviously that's good for us as a party. We also have our big group who are able to hold the government to account in the Commons. And I know, Chris, you think that sometimes we go too easy on the government. I'd say that actually we just have to take a slightly different tack to the Conservatives. The Conservatives remain, the main opposition party in terms of numbers in the Commons, and I think there's really little point in us just aping whatever they say. I think we have to take a different tack, which is trying to be slightly less party political, but really going on the policies and on the issues. And I think that is what Ed Davey tries to do at PMQs. And I think it's interesting that you talked about the fact that Kemi Badenoch often goes on one thing and then for the last couple of questions, goes on something else. It's interesting that Ed Davey, who obviously has just the two questions, but he tends to go on a domestic issue on one and a foreign issue on the other. And I think that's quite effective. That gives him two bites of the cherry in terms of what may be shown in news bulletins and what's put out on social media. So again, I think that's quite a clever tactic from him. But as you know, Chris, I don't just ape whatever the Lib Dem line is on whatever it is. I am quite independent and sometimes get in a wee bit of trouble with the party actually because of what I sometimes say. But I hope that shows that the both of us on here on this podcast are of political parties, but are also independent in what we say, and the fact that we are prepared to be critical. I do think there are still things to worry about for the Lib Dems actually, and I think I think beneath, if I can put it, those 72 MPs, which is a shining, wonderful thing, and I think they're going to do great work over this Parliament. I do think there's some rumblings about what direction the Lib Dems now take with this renewed parliamentary force. What do we now do about it? And there's kind of two blocks of opinion, which is that there's the Liberal Reform people, what used to be known as the Orange Book type people, who still exist. Sorry.
They still exist.
They absolutely do, and they think that we should want to replace the Tories and become kind of a centre-right FDP style economic liberal political party. And then you have the bulk of the party, I still have to say, whose beating heart is on the centre left and is kind of in the vein of Paddy Ashdown and of Charles Kennedy. And Ed Davey keeps his cards close to his chest in terms of where he wants us to go. So as with any political party, there's always kind of rumblings about what direction we're taking, and the Lib Dems are no different in that. And then of course we do have the fact that the Greens are there to the left of us. And are also now a parliamentary force with four MPs, I think, 4 or 5 MPs. And they're not to be ignored either. I'm sure they are absolutely going to make their mark in this parliament. And if Reform are getting a fair amount of what I'd call the protest vote, the Greens are too. And for the Lib Dems, it's become a little bit harder for us to always get that protest vote, partly because of the fact that we are such a multi-party democracy now, but also the legacy of the coalition, and as much as I don't think that hangs around our necks quite as much as it did in past years, it is still there. And we have still got the legacy of that government, albeit though I think there are 2 or 3 or 4 good things that we did during those years, but by goodness me, it was a difficult few years. So it'd be interesting to see what tack the Lib Dems take. Interesting. I don't know if you noticed this past week, Chris, but there had to be a Lib Dem leadership election.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And actually, Ed Davey won it because it wasn't contested, and I think quite right too. I mean, I think having won these 72 MPs, he should be able to lead us for as long as he wants to. But equally, I think that again, as with all political parties, there are those amongst the new group who will see themselves as future leaders, and we'll be interested to see when that day comes.
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing. I mean, and you've got 72 of them, so surely among that amount of MPs, there will be at least a few who will emerge as leadership quality people, and that could be a problem for Davey. I think that's the case. I think you mentioned the campaign earlier, the rather interesting approach that Ed Davey took to campaigning, and yes, you could say as much as I think it's quite disgraceful, it was actually effective, and it did get him ultimately the results, but he has continued that kind of thing into this parliament. And yes, he did the single, and I wouldn't criticize anybody for making a single for charity, but he has he has done like silly dancing and things like that. And is there really a kind of a point where he really does need to stop that? And if he wants to be seen as a potential deputy prime minister, he's got to present himself as something more serious, because at the moment, this might be not a politically correct or a pretty cruel thing to say, but I have to say he does remind me a bit of Mr. Tumble, I think his name is, the children's comedy character, and that's who, I'm sorry, but that's who he reminds me at the moment of, a children's comedy character. What does he want to be, that or a serious politician?
Well, look, and of course the fact is that he has been a cabinet minister, Secretary of State for climate and energy and all the rest of that during the current. Well, I mean, whatever you think of that, I mean, the fact is he has held cabinet rank office. But look, I'll be honest with you, Chris. I quite often roll my eyes when I see what he's doing. But equally, even with 72 MPs, and part of me thinks this is disgraceful, because I think that we should basically be on every political panel now, on every pretty much on every TV political broadcast, and I think it's disgraceful actually that we're not. We still have to fight to get coverage, and one of the ways that we do that, and that Ed is doing that, is by occasionally doing these things which you wouldn't necessarily expect a political party leader to do. Now, whether the public ends up getting a bit sick of that, we'll see. But at the moment, I think I think people quite like it, and so we'll see what happens. What we really need those 72 MPs to do, though, Chris, is to, and Lib Dems are usually pretty good at this, is that when they win seats, they really embed themselves in those seats, and they become, and I know people may get sick of hearing this phrase as well, but they become great local community champions, and are really seen out and about in their communities, and are easily contactable and hold surgeries and all the rest of it. And that is what we need them to do, because especially if Labour continue to be unpopular, because I think it's true to say that quite often the Lib Dems are popular when Labour are also popular. It's almost as if there's permission to vote for the Lib Dems. What we need to have is a situation that if Labour continue to go down the plug hole, that obviously we still want to be in a position where we can not only retain our 72 MPs, but grow our parliamentary force. And I think the only way that is going to happen is if people say, well, actually, regardless of what's going on with the government and how unpopular they are, our local MP has been a good, decent local MP, and we're going to continue to back that person. And so I think, that is what and I'm sure that all of our MPs are busy doing that. I see all of their stuff that they're doing in their constituencies and events they're attending and etc. So I think that they're all working really hard to hopefully retain their seats at the next election. And then what we need to do as a party is to not only look to take more seats off the Tories, and we're seconding quite a few of those seats, but also now start to take some Labour seats. I think we should be taking, we should be looking to take Southwark and other Labour seats too, Sheffield Hallam and others too, away from Labour.
But I think in order to do all of this, you really need to distinguish yourself. And you often tweet whenever Labour makes a decision that you disagree with, what are Labour for? I would ask that same questions of the Liberal Democrats. I am completely not clear as to what the Liberal Democrats are for. You campaign very well on care, social care, and don't get me wrong, that's a very important issue, and Davey has campaigned very effectively on that. But I don't. Beyond that, what is the Lib Dems identity? And do you have any kind of advice, especially from your experiences as an activist, as a councillor, being able to establish yourself in some form of government? Did you have any kind of advice there which may help the party in order to establish this distinct identity, especially from Labour? Because I'm having trouble distinguishing you from Labour, because you seem to do the same kind of thing.
So I think 4 things. I think we need to become the champions, but just have this as our sole focus, that we hammer on these things. I think we need to be the party of the NHS. I think we need to be, as we have been in the past, I think it's fair to say, the party of education, and really supporting a good education for all. And I hope we bring back the penny on income tax for education, because I think actually that's more honest, a more honest approach than the approach Labour took of saying that we can better fund public services, but also, we're not going to raise taxes, and we see where that has ended up landing them. I think we need to be the party for local government, and I think we need to champion district and borough councils, and not allow those easily, at least, to be axed by this government in favour of unitaries. And I think we need to be, and this one is the hardest, because it's the hardest one, I think, to get masses of people to necessarily think about and care about, is we need to be the party of constitutional reform, and that means an elected House of Lords. It means PR for all elections,
more referendums,
and all the rest of it. So, sorry,
more referendums.
No, not more referendums. No,
that's what you used to say. That's what you used. You all for referendums at one point.
Not more. Let's not mention that word ever again. But no. So I think those 4 things we need to become the champions of. And I think that's what we're starting to see now. I'd like to see ourselves on a number of issues, place ourselves to the left of Starmer's Labour, which actually still isn't very left wing, but it's to the left of Starmer's Labour, a little bit like Charles Kennedy was clearly to the left of Blair. That's what I'd like to see us do. But as I say, there is this underneath those 72 MPs. There is this, and albeit Lib Dems do it very politely, but there is this kind of discussion. I don't want to say battle, but there is this discussion going on about the future direction of the party. And I can tell you that, I'm sure that some of our MPs will be, I'm sure they'll be very loyal to the leadership. I'm not saying otherwise, but I equally think they will be making their voices known as this Parliament goes on about where the future of the party should lie.
Do you think Davey will still be? Well, do you think you will enter in the next election with Ed Davey as your leader?
Well, Lib Dems and prior to that, Liberal leaders tend to do about 10 years. And I think Ed Davey has still got some way to go.
Oh, no.
I think Ed Davey has still got some way to go. Look, let's be honest. The guy has brought us this fantastic result, and I think he ought to be allowed to have his few years as the more years as the leader of the party. then I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think Daisy Cooper will be absolutely, who's fantastic, and I know her quite well. I
She's
campaigned
a
for
good
her when
media performer. Yeah,
she's a good media
I'd give her
performer, and
that. Yeah.
I campaigned for her when she was running to be president, unsuccessfully as it happened, but was running to be president of the party a number of years ago. And so I think she will have a very good chance. But I think there are others from the new intake who, whether it be this next time or time after, will be looking to run for the leadership. People like Josh Barber-Inde and MP for Eastbourne and others. So I think we've got some good performers who could become national figures for the Lib Dems. I mean, should we be aiming to become? Look, we should always be aiming to do better. We should be aiming to become the main party of government. That should be our ultimate aim. But we have to be realistic as well. But we're not all that many seats off the Tories, Chris. I mean, this is what people are forgetting.
Yeah.
We're really not. They've got 121. We've got 72. That's not that big a leap,
Yeah, and that is definitely something that is an interesting observation, and the Tories do need to be mindful of as well. Yeah, so interesting times ahead. It will be interesting.
Well, indeed. Now, Chris, I think it's time for the return of this as we say goodbye.
Yeah.
Here we go. Here we go. There. Look at that. There we go. Love that. Okay.
I think we've really kind of established where the parties are, and we've evaluated 2024, and 2025 might not be as dramatic in political terms, because we well who knows, but we probably won't have a general election, but 2025 will be a very interesting year, and it's definitely a year to look forward to.
It absolutely is. I'm looking forward to it. And obviously, in international politics, it'll be the start of the Trump administration, and goodness knows what that is going to bring us. But whether it be local or international, we'll be here to cover it each week here on Political Frenemies. And obviously, Chris, people can find us on all the internet ways, can't they?
Yeah. So we're on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, tap the bell, all of that lovely stuff. We're on Spotify, Apple. We've got our own Substack page, and we're on various other podcasting platforms as well. And we will be back. Now, I don't think there is much point of us covering over the next couple of weeks whilst everybody's on the break. So we are off when Parliament is off, and we will be back at the weekend after Parliament has returned. So Parliament returns, I think, on the 6th, and we will publish our new episode in the new year, sometime during the weekend of the 11th and the 12th of January. So put that in your diary, spread the word, and make sure that you are ready, poised for our new episode in the new year. And we've got I'm planning a little refresh of the look as well. So that's another thing to look forward to as well.
All right. Until then, it's Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, and see you on the next episode of Political Frenemies. Merry Christmas, everyone.